Welcome back from break. Welcome to the Reasons to Believe workshop on our creation model, focusing on human origins in conjunction with those from Peaceful Science and many other organizations. This is now the panel discussion in response to Fazale Rana's presentation on the RTB human origins model with the focus on the archaeological evidence. I have joining me on the panel today three scholars, two in person and one via Zoom. And I just want to remind everybody that the panel discussion will be facilitated questions offered in rounds by the participating panelists, interspersed with Fuzz's responses. I will be both the facilitator and a participant, and the focal point of the panel is to engage the RTB human origins model. We hope that you, the panelists, will bring questions that help illuminate how the GAE model and RTB's progressive creation model of human origins may complement one another, but we would also like to encourage questions that will help identify and define where the RTB model fits well with mainstream science and where it may still face significant challenges from observational or computational science. Your questions and insights regarding RTB's approach toward integrating scientific and biblical data and theological challenges raised by RTB's model or the GAE model that may be in tension or in conflict will bring great light to our conversation and to our future endeavors and directions. We'd like to thank each of you again as participants on the panel for giving of your time and most especially your expertise. And so I'm joined today by Dr. Nathan Lentz. He holds a doctorate in human physiology and completed postdoctoral work training in genomics and computational biology at New York University. He's been on the faculty of John Jay College of the City University of New York since 2006 and was promoted to full professor in 2016. His research is on the evolution of the human genome, and he has authored dozens of scientific papers and book chapters. He's a popular science writer, contributing articles in outlets including the Wall Street Journal, Skeptic Magazine, and Science. And he's also written two books on the evolution of modern humans, Not So Different and Human Errors. And you can learn more about his writing and his blogging on the Human blog?
The Human Evolution blog.
The humanevolutionblog.com. We're joined also today by Dr. William Lane Craig, professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and at Houston Baptist University. Bill earned a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, England, and a doctorate in theology from the Ludwig Maximilians University in München, Germany, where he was for 2 years a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Prior to appointment at Talbot, he spent 7 years at the Higher Institute of Philosophy of the Catholic University, Leuven, Belgium. His research interests include the interface of philosophy of religion, philosophy of mathematics, and the philosophy of space and time. He's authored or edited over 40 books, including the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and published nearly 200 articles in professional publications, such as the Journal of Philosophy, the British Journal for Philosophy of Science, and International Studies in the Philosophy of Science, many of which are available online at reasonablefaith.org. Joining us from Boston is Dr. Steve Schaffner. He's a computational biologist at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, where he has spent the past 20 years as a staff scientist. While there, Steve has studied human genetic variation, the effect of population history and natural selection on variation, and the genetics of infectious diseases. Steve has an earned PhD in experimental particle physics and a master's degree in English literature. Thank you for joining us, Steve. Okay, I am going to, again, give us each a chance to ask a question. Fuzz will have a chance to respond. I will keep my eye on whether you'd like a rejoinder, all in brief, of course, and concise. And I'll also keep my eye on the other panelists to see if they want to weigh in as the comments go. We'll begin with you, Nathan. Thank you.
Okay, can you all hear me okay? Is the microphone picking up? Okay. Well, I enjoyed your presentation very much, and I liked that you were close to taking a position, I think, that the image of God was first present or was made present in Homo sapiens sapiens, behaviorally modern, or sometimes called fully modern humans. One couple of things you might have to contend with maintaining that position. First of all, they originate very clearly in Africa, not in the Middle East. So that I was wondering when that was going to come up or if it would come up. And also the markings that we have for behaviorally modern humans, whether it's artwork and crafting of complex tools and composite tools and so on. While it really does explode at 65,000 years ago, and then moves out of Africa from there, we have evidence of it appearing ephemerally before that, and you did reference some of that, particularly with artwork. So I would also wonder how you deal with the fact that it really didn't just begin at one spot. It took off at one spot, but we have evidence of it older than that. And then finally, my last point about that is that it's looking more and more like a multi-regional African origin. Genetically speaking. So it wasn't just in East Africa as we originally thought. It looks like some contributions from Northern and Western Africa as well. So you could probably combine that all in one answer, I think.
Okay, so I can't remember what the first question was. I'm sorry.
Africa, not the Middle East.
Not Middle East.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, we actually addressed that issue in Who Was Adam? And we point out that when you look at the description of the location for the Garden of Eden, there is this reference to the land of Cush, which is understood as Ethiopia. So what you're looking at is essentially, potentially the Garden of Eden could have extended into portions of Africa. And I'd also argue too that when you're kind of trying to reconstruct the precise location for humanity's origin, I mean, you're looking at genetic variability, and then you're trying to map that on top of the location where people are today and where you're trying to infer where they would have been through history. I don't know how precise that mapping would be. So in other words, you're winding up with a location that isn't, scientifically, that isn't completely outlandish, in terms of what you would expect from the biblical text or from a careful reading of the biblical text. Yeah, your point about the flickering of of symbolism that seems to emerge, I think is a good point. And so the question becomes, is that a flickering or is it a selection effect? Because where you see the strongest signal for symbolism are in the caves in South Africa, where you've got an environment that's much more conducive to archaeological preservation. So so to me, I think it's, in my mind, it's still an open question as to what the precise mode and tempo was for that origin. And I think, this is something that, I mean, I don't know if I'm sidestepping the issue or not that you're raising, but so often I think as we're working on these questions in human origins, I don't think I think you do, but I don't think a lot of people appreciate just how complex and messy this is, not only scientifically, but biblically and theologically. And a lot of times we don't have the data where we need it to have it the most. It's rather sparse. And so from my perspective, in terms of at least our project at Reasons to Believe, if we can at least show that there's harmony between our model and the scientific record, maybe not that high precision validation, but at least that we can show that there's harmony. At least it says that there's credibility to this idea, that this is not something that can necessarily be completely dismissed. So I think that issue that you're raising with the flickering is still something that, in my mind, maybe is not resolved scientifically, but I would acknowledge that it is a point where we need to do continued work. And then the idea this maybe was a multi-regional Africa origin as opposed to a single location, I'm seeing that as well. I wonder if, and this is actually asking you a question now, how much of that is the distribution of the near anatomically modern humans, with the assumption that those near anatomically modern humans evolved towards a modern form, or a truly modern form, from where you're assuming that it must be multi-regional from the fossil record, and how much of that is really a genetic signal. And again, given the uncertainty between connecting the location of people groups today, where you're sampling the genetic material from where they may have actually resided originally, how much of that uncertainty plays into that multi-regional interpretation versus a single origin? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or evading it, but I think I guess I'm not convinced that there's enough to say that this is conclusively what happened. But
well, the evidence I did have in mind is from the fossils. So, but it was all prior to behavioral modernity. So the genetic signature that we see from populations throughout Africa persists to this day, but is from an origin prior to behavioral modernity. So I think the state of the field, and actually my colleague might be able to say more about this, is that there seems to be genetic contribution from multi-regional foci in Africa. But I think for the most part you answered my question the best you could.
I was also going to ask Dr. Schaffner, Steve, if he'd like to respond, since part of Fuzz's question was in your field of expertise.
Okay, so I'll respond to that, to continue to respond to that question. I just, by the way, you may have noticed it's dark here in Boston, and I believe it's snowing now. So enjoy not being here. I think the genetic indications are at this point, the genetic understanding is that within Africa, populations probably, existing populations probably started to diverge about 300,000 years ago. And there's pretty good evidence, not rock solid evidence, but pretty good evidence for integration from a something equivalent to Neanderthal integration into Europeans, that something similar happened within Africa after the out of Africa migration, so that there has been integration within Africa from a fairly diverged population that was also persisting in Africa. We don't have the ancient DNA to compare it to, so it's not as solid as the Neanderthal Denisovan cases, but it was some pretty good evidence.
Okay, in-house it's really difficult to hear Steve Schaffner, so for some of us it may be quite impossible. So I'm wondering if we can get the volume up in-house for Steve.
I can also talk louder.
That was better. Yeah, that was a lot better. So thank you, Steve. By the way, I like some of the puns that you guys are making, and you're like passing by them so quickly you don't even emphasize them, like the rock solid evidence when you were and Fuzz made one to bona fide data on the Neanderthal flute. Anyway, Bill, unless you had okay, yeah, Bill, we'll move on to you.
Although I have some theological questions, I want to add to what Nathan has said, since he's turned our attention to the archaeological evidence, which I really agree with you about is going to be the key for determining when modern behaviors first emerge. And I noticed in an article by McBrary and Alison Brooks that they accept the same criteria that you do for spotting modern behavior. They list the following: abstract thinking, that is the ability to act with reference to abstract concepts, not limited in time and space; planning depth, the ability to formulate strategies based on past experience and to act upon them in a group context; behavioral, economic, and technological innovativeness; and symbolic behavior, the ability to represent objects, people, and abstract concepts with arbitrary symbols, vocal or visual, and to reify such symbols in cultural practice. And they note that these are universally accepted as criteria for modern behavior. But they argue that, and I quote, tangible traces of these early behavioral shifts toward modernity can be seen in the African archaeological record and can be tied explicitly to hominid cognitive and cultural capabilities. And so they want to push this back a lot farther. They have a figure 13 in which they list on the left-hand side the various archaeological signs of modern human behavior, and then the date at which these first emerge. And as you can see, blades go back to 280,000 years, grindstones back to 280,000 years, pigment processing back to 280,000 years, points go back to around 250,000 years, long distance exchange, 140,000 years. So the archaeological evidence, I think, that's coming out of Africa is very suggestive that humanity is a lot older than the RTB model suggest. And I want to just add one more thing to that. When you throw in Europe and Asia and the Middle East, in addition to Africa, then I think the evidence becomes even more compelling. This is from the book, The Human Brain Evolving. They point out that in the 6th time interval of the evolution of the human brain, from about 750,000 years ago to 250,000 years ago, that is to say the earlier Middle Pleistocene, they say this time interval documents the emergence of the larger-brained Homo heidelbergensis. It also documents the development of finely made Archeolian hand axes and cleavers, and a gradual shift to flake tool industries, some with prepared core technologies of the Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic. The earliest wooden spears are known from this time, as well as the first possible evidence of ritualistic behavior. Hominins in Africa, Europe, and Western Asia show encephalization, about 300 cc larger than later Homo erectus. The most encephalized hominins include Homo heidelbergensis, and on it goes. They say a number of technological advances are observed in the archaeological record during this time. This is 750 to 250,000 years ago. These include more refined forms of artifacts, more formal tool forms, new and more elaborate techniques for tool production, new categories of tools and evidence at some sites, indirect evidence of improved hunting technology, possible evidence of symbolic behavior, including the use of ochre pigments, refined hand axes and cleavers, soft hammers of antler, bone, or ivory or softer stone, platform preparation on the edges of cores and bifaces. They mention in particular, one, the wooden spears that are preserved at sites like Schöningen in Germany. This, to me, is a game changer. These wooden spears that were discovered in Schöningen in the late 1990s are associated in Boxgrove, England, with Homo heidelbergensis. And they're about over 6 feet to over 7 feet long, and they're sculpted so that they tail to a point at the end, and most of the weight is in the front third of the sphere, which makes it perfect for throwing. And experts have reproduced reproductions of these spears, and they have found them to be the equivalent of modern Olympic javelins. Now, I find it impossible to think this was made by a beast. They were used in big game hunting like rhinoceros and horses, which would require cooperative behavior, foresight, planning, maybe communication ability. So I resonate with what you're saying about the archaeological record and its importance, but I wonder if you haven't underestimated it.
So that's remarkable that you were able to turn all of that into one question at the end.
I know.
I heard about 10 as you were going along.
But it was worth raising, right? I mean, this is really important.
Yes.
With
I agree.
theologians like this, who needs archaeologists?
Yeah. Well, I'm sympathetic to your point, and in some respects, it really, I mean, the point that you're making is that it's a challenge to try to equate capability with what type of artifact that you would predict, and again, when does that actually become a bona fide signature, no pun intended, for, again, for the image of God. So I'm highly sympathetic to your point, and I don't want to give the impression, though I probably did, even though that I would refer to Neanderthals or Homo heidelbergensis as being cognitively inferior to humans. I don't want to give the sense that they didn't have intelligent intellectual capability. And the question of is tool manufacture, is the manufacturing of hunting implements really a sufficient marker for for symbolism or for the image of God or not? I tend to want to place it with symbolic capabilities. To me, that's where I want to place it. But I don't dispute that there's some remarkable behavior going on there. And so, I mean, I think you raise a valid point that in terms of when we're using the archaeological record as a probe, perhaps we do need to be maybe a lot more circumspect as to exactly what artifacts we would connect with the image of God and what we wouldn't. So I appreciate your point. I think it boils down to maybe a difference of, I wouldn't say opinion, that seems too trivial, but just a difference as to what we see as being really the key marker for the image of God, right?
I'd like to follow up, if I may, just with one observation. Internally, sometimes we've bounced around the range of the intermediate dating for Adam and Eve, and I've heard us, on speculation, go over the 200,000 year mark.
Right.
And I think that what drives that speculation is primarily the fossil record that indicates the globularity of what we would consider fully modern anatomically humans. And so I guess the question that comes out of that is, is our model open to go back later, and if so, or earlier, I guess, and if so, how far earlier?
Well,
not as far as Bill suggested 700,000 years ago, but
I mean, I would be uncomfortable connecting Adam to Homo heidelbergensis. I would be open to connecting Adam to near anatomically modern humans, right? And to me, part of it is, again, if we are progenitors of Adam and we're anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, that influences how I would look at that archaeological record.
And so to clarify for the rest of us, Nathan and Steve and Fuzz, if the RTB model include near anatomically modern humans, how far back would that push the date, and what impact would that have on the genetic questions that you guys were addressing earlier?
It would be in the neighborhood of 200,000 years ago. In that neighborhood.
And would that resolve any of the genetic questions that Steve and Nathan were?
Yeah.
Okay. Would it?
Yeah.
Moving in that direction, probably.
Yeah, it would be moving in that direction. I would put it to be safer to account for modern genetic diversity, more like 300,000, I think. But I also think that both with mitochondrial Eve and
Y chromosome.
And just the estimates of current genetic diversity, I think we all tend to overinterpret that evidence a little bit, in the sense that it's much more sensitive to quirks of population dynamics and bottlenecks and things than it's really reflective of a history. I mean, you can't calibrate the molecular clock that well on short time frames like this. So the range, you end up with these big ranges. It could be 800,000. I mean, I wouldn't, definitely the split from Homo heidelbergensis was complete by 800,000, but we could put that as the root, and that would still fit within the margin of error, I think.
Steve, good news is we're coming to you for the next question, so you can comment on this, and then when you're ready, transition into your next question.
So, okay. I think my question would be related to this. Maybe it's a suggestion in the form of a question. As a population geneticist, a population geneticist listening to your talk will be unhappy at a number of points in some of the evidence you're presenting. And I think unnecessarily so, the way you're presenting it. Specifically, the fact that you're using mitochondria and the Y chromosome, what that means is you're not using the bulk of the genome, 98% of the genome. And sort of more importantly, each individual, mitochondria is one instance of the history, and it's a very random history, and the Y chromosome is another instance. The rest of the chromosomes have about 100,000 additional instances of the history, and that gives us a great deal more information. It's also typically 4 times older information than come from the Y and mitochondria. Can you hear me, by the way?
We can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll speak even louder just in case. And so, as Josh alluded to earlier, I think it's very hard from multiple ways of looking at that data to explain the data we see from a single couple less than 500,000 years ago. 500,000 years ago, I think it gets quite muddy. If you pushed, maybe there's 400,000, 200,000 seems very difficult to me. But the thing is, the model you seem to be currently talking about isn't actually a single couple 200,000 years ago, because you're allowing introgression from Neanderthals and Denisovans and possibly others. And from a population genetics point of view, I don't care what you call them. Those are ancestors. and they're contributing to our genetic variation. And given that you are allowing this, why are you focusing so much on the kind of measure that isn't as you're unnecessarily constraining yourself? It seems to me you can allow 5% integration. What happens if you allow 20% integration? Would that affect your basic conceptual model? And it would make your interaction with genetics a lot easier if you did that.
Which is kind of the strength of Josh's model, I think, is that it allows for all of that.
So that was a comment or a question?
Yes.
Steve, were you asking, so why is fuzz or RTB constraining itself to that model? Or are you making a suggestion that integration with Neanderthals and or Denisovans or other classes other than Homo sapiens sapien is erasing the genetic problem, and so we're emphasizing something that's just creating a problem for the model?
I think you're creating a problem that's not necessarily there, that you're allowing for a solution to the problem in your model, but the way you're presenting the genetic data, it seems to be for maybe historical reasons, I don't know, but it seems that you're emphasizing descent from a single couple 200,000 years ago, and that's not really what your model is now. Does that make sense?
Buzz, do you have?
No, I mean, okay, I'll just say point taken. I mean, we do talk about in Who Was Adam other studies in molecular anthropology that are looking at other regions of the genome that are giving, again, I think, a comparable result or a compatible result to what you see with Y chromosomal DNA and mitochondrial DNA. It just seems to me that I think part of the appeal is, again, you don't have recombination. You've got this cleaner pattern of inheritance, and you have no evidence for integration. So it's allowing you to see more clearly the signal for modern humans as opposed to having all the integration that I think is complicating trying to pinpoint when you would have Adam and Eve, if you will.
So I'm going to take the mic because it's my turn to ask a question, and I sort of have one. And it's related to these comments, and hopefully maybe bringing some clarity for the majority of us that maybe is already clear in the 4 of your or the 3 of your minds. So from the RTB model, if we date a primordial human pair that are the sole human pair that are giving rise to all modern, anatomically modern, or full anatomically modern humans, or near anatomically modern humans, wherever we place that boundary, then we're saying that's the beginning of the human, realizing the difficulty in defining that term scientifically, but the human headwaters, and that any introgression happened after that. And so the introgression that happens after that, how would that affect the genetic signals that are dating the origin of that pair, if we're considering that data? Is that making it impossible to date the origins of the pair because we've allowed for subsequent integration? Or is it going to push the origin of that pair back because subsequent integration has taken place? This is my question.
It certainly push it back. I hope I'm allowed to answer this. I think it will push it back. Exactly how much will depend on which kind of data you're looking at and what your model is for when integration happened, how much integration happened. And there are ways of studying it, but it hasn't been studied very thoroughly, I don't think, because this isn't commonly a question that comes up in the scientific literature, which is, how recently could a single pair, how recently could Adam and Eve have lived?
So could I follow it up with just rephrasing the question one different way, perhaps? So if there's subsequent integration, have we erased the ability to identify the point in time of an original primordial pair?
Well, I'm not a population geneticist, but that would be part of my concern. So that to me is why I would be looking for some region where you've got a clean signal that's free of integration. I just think it gives you a clean signal, and I recognize the limitations that it imposes. I'm not denying that, but in a sense, we're not looking at accounting for human genetic diversity in the sense that I think a lot of people that are working on that question are interested in terms of understanding the human genome, right? But it's more, where do you see that signal for the origin event? Recognizing that then the idea of integration and these other contributors, would be for our concerns secondary issues. Now, where you may be able, in my opinion, to go and get a clean signal would be if you take advantage of regions where you have Neanderthal or the integration gene deserts, right? Or the integration deserts in the human genome. That may be a place, if you have regions that are clearly identified and recognized as being deserts for integration, right, that you might be able to use those regions to get the signal.
So those regions that show no signs of integration are often referred to as Neanderthal deserts or gene deserts, correct?
Right, yeah, well, not gene deserts, but Neanderthal deserts. Gene deserts
okay.
means something else, right? But
yeah, and the problem is that each of these variables affects the other in your calculation, right? So you have to know two of the three variables, whether the size of the last bottleneck, how recent it was, and the degree of integration. So the degree of integration is sometimes inferred by finding integration-free populations, but then, that doesn't, but the solution, as with everything, is more fossils. And this is what we say all the time, is if we only had more fossils. But that's the great thing about this field, is that we're finding more fossils all the time. I mean, from your presentation today, I was reading a lot of your blog yesterday. There's already things that I know you've changed your mind about that I was prepared to ask you just in the last 10 years because of the fossils that we found. So what I would urge in any belief statement that you're thinking about right now is 10 years from now, you don't want to look stupid. So don't underestimate what we can find and what we can learn from the new fossils that they're constantly digging up. I mean, the human fossil record, this is one of the most under-celebrated facts about human biology, is actually really good. The human fossil record is probably the best of any living species right now, partially because of the interest in it, but also just the locations that humans lived in lend itself to fossilization. So we have a really complete record. And actually,
it's your turn for your next
great. So it
question.
leads to my question. So you made a statement that you look at the evidence and that seems to support common design rather than common descent, and I have a couple of criticisms and questions about that. First of all, one question I would have is, what evidence would discriminate common design versus common descent in this context? I'm not talking about how cells are put together or anything like that. With human evolution in particular, what kind of evidence would discriminate common design from common descent? Because it seems to me that this continuum of fossils really, really suggests a constant continuum, a continuous common ancestry, where it becomes almost impossible to separate Homo heidelbergensis from Homo sapiens and early Neanderthals. And we know that they had a common African origin there. And to me, it really, every fossil we find fills more in on that picture where there aren't these huge gaps. People talk about gaps. There are gaps in the fossil record, but not much into the human fossil record. So what kind of evidence would push you towards design or descent?
Yeah, well, I would just simply point out that this is the underdetermination problem, right, in science, which is theories are underdetermined by data. And so you could take two radically distinct theories and those theories could accommodate the same set of data. And so one of the things that we're working on is a kind of a genomics model that would employ kind of a design framework as opposed to a descent framework that I think could potentially account for the shared features and similarities that you see. It's something that we've not done an enormous amount of work on. So I guess from my perspective, maybe the answer is I don't know that you could actually discriminate between those two ideas.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard with genomics until we can get way more ancient DNA than we have. But with the fossils anyway, which we're putting a lot of emphasis on archaeology and the fossils, I think it's really hard to come up with created kinds, if that's the position, if that's the design position with human evolution, because all of the kinds really blend into one another. I mean, Homo erectus was around for 1.5 million years, continuously changing through that, and other species were springing out. And I really don't see any created kinds that you could draw around almost any of these species. I mean, and you can argue.
And at this point, I think we're talking about different things, because I'm thinking about the common design from the perspective of the shared genomic features, where you're inferring an evolutionary history versus looking at the fossil record. And so in our framework, we would look at God intervening at particular points in time, but then would allow for some limited evolution, right? We would allow for speciation to take place. So to me, I think what you would be looking at is essentially kind of distinct creation events that are then overlaid by evolutionary processes, right?
So what Fuzz is doing is trying to offer an alternative paradigm, not trying to claim that he has an inductively proven theory, but this is a different paradigm that would be empirically adequate to the evidence.
But
that's not to exclude other paradigms.
Right, and so maybe let me take a step back, just, and we're maybe getting a little bit off here, but for me, there are other features of the history of life that convince me that there's got to be some kind of involvement by a mind, right? For me, the origin of life was, the origin of life question was really very important. And so once you start adopting a position that maybe the origin of life, or maybe other transitions in the history of life, like the eukaryotic Big Bang, or maybe the Cambrian explosion, require something beyond what a strictly mechanistic process, where there's a mind that's somehow infusing into the system, then it opens up the possibility of viewing all of life's history in those terms. But then from our perspective, then the challenge becomes, well, then what do you do with what people see as evidence for common descent? And so this is where we're then coming to the table and saying, well, could you adopt something kind of following the footsteps of Richard Owen, where there's archetypes that are then overlaid on top of an evolutionary history, or the evolutionary history, is overlaid on top of the archetypes. And so we're not trying to say that there's no evidence for evolution and therefore it's our approach, but rather we're saying we acknowledge that there's evidence that people see as evidence for common descent, but can we present a framework that can account for that data, that is not ad hoc, but actually has, it's very important to me that there's some kind of historical precedence that I can point to.
If I might just sort of weigh in, bringing some of the concepts together of the empirical equivalence, or the different paradigms, the different interpretations of the same set of data, I think with each new discovery of fossils, that there's a pressure on the discoverer to point out the unique features, and it's my understanding that the bush gets bushier, and that it's not really a clean set of transitions, and yet we're still able to distinguish those fossils as, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the language because this just is not my field house, but the Anthropocenes and the Erectines and the ancient homos and the modern homos, it's like those are still, we're able to distinguish the fossil when we pick it up, and so, or discover it, right? And so there's still some discontinuity there in those major groups. And I think what our model is trying to reflect currently is that within those groups, we have no reason to think that a type of speciation or adaptation or changes in morphology, and yet we still see enough discontinuity that we're able to distinguish an Anthropocene from an Erectine and if these correlate with differences in behavior, and then we reach a point sort of like Fuzz was talking about, where Neanderthals were around for hundreds of thousands of years with very little behavioral capacity increase observed in the archaeological data, and then we have anatomically modern humans come on the scene, and within a very short amount of time, geologically speaking, we have rapid development. And so from our paradigm, we're looking at that same set of data, and we're saying it seems to fit this creation model. Yeah. And we're not saying that therefore all of evolutionary theory is wrong.
Right. Well, I mean, and let me add this point, and This is not meant to be, a criticism, right? But, to me, I would agree with you that the hominin fossil record is unbelievable. It's an incredible human achievement that we've scientifically have this kind of record. But yet, it's still in places remarkably sparse, and because of that, I mean, sometimes there's a species defined by a single specimen, so you don't have an understanding necessarily that's a good understanding of things like sexual dimorphism. You don't have an understanding of how the variation was in that region or even across time that still would be encompassed in a single species. And so to me, it's really hard, I think, when you're interpreting the fossil record, and then of course you have the lumper and the splitter influence. And so it's really hard when you're looking at the fossil record to know, are you actually looking at bona fide distinct species, or are you actually looking at a variation that you're interpreting as some kind of continuous evolution that's just simply the natural variation, for example, there's a number of celebrated examples, nothing's coming to my mind immediately, where there's been a single find and suddenly people thought, for example, that Homo georgicus, for example, was a distinct, maybe a habiline or maybe an early erectine, and then you make this single find, and then suddenly there's a whole bunch of species that are collapsed into a single species, right? Rudolfensis and Georgicus, and just from a single find. So,
and these are lessons hard learned in anthropology, where they would find just a part of a skull cap. And then as we find more fossils and realize that the cranium and the postcranial skeleton don't always match, and we're all mosaics of different parts. I mean, Homo naledi is a great example because they actually found all the skeletons all together. But if they had just found a wrist, if they had just found an ankle, if they had just found a face bone, they would have classified it very differently in all of those. And in fact, the only thing they were missing was the very front part of the face. And once they got that in the second cave, they realized they had the face wrong. So, and the lesson there is to not make hard pronouncements, and to stay tentative and say, qualify all your statements and just wait for more evidence. And that's the advice I give to my scientific colleagues, and I would, give it here as well. Just tentative, let the data come in. There's a lot of time. In the fullness of time, the truth will show itself.
I think we're comfortable in that position. Bill, would you like to offer the next question?
Sure. If we might shift gears to theology, RTB has shown itself remarkably and admirably open to revising its interpretation of the scientific evidence. Is RTB equally willing to look again with fresh eyes at the biblical material and ask whether that's been perhaps misinterpreted? By way of background, the stories about Adam and Eve are part of the primeval history of Genesis 1 to 11, which has to be interpreted within the context of the whole book of Genesis, which has to be interpreted in the context of the Pentateuch as a whole. And every Old Testament scholar recognizes a marked difference between chapters 1 to 11 of the primeval history and Genesis 12 to 50, the patriarchal narratives. The stories of the primeval history have parallels thematically in the ancient mythology of Mesopotamia and the Near East, and treat many of the same subjects. The narrative rushes along until it hits chapter 12 with the call of Abraham, and then it slams on the brakes and takes a more leisurely pace forward. Moreover, not only does this primeval history share many of the same themes as pagan mythology, but it is characterized by the same interest in etiology, which is attempting to ground a society's present values and identity in events of the primordial past. And Genesis 1 to 11 is filled with these etiological motifs. The most significant one would be Sabbath observant, which was definitive for Israel, the observance of the Sabbath. And this is grounded in God's resting on the seventh day after creation. And then in Exodus, the command for Sabbath observance is given based upon the seventh day of rest. So I think we need to ask ourselves again, are these actually supposed to be narratives read as straightforward history? Or are these, in fact, Hebrew monotheistic myths? Now, even if they concern historical persons, they might belong to a genre that the Assyriologist Torkild Jakobsen called mytho-history. This is what Bill Arnold has said, professor of Old Testament at Asbury Seminary, and a number of others. Gordon Wenham is sympathetic to this idea. What this would mean is that it is about real people, all right, but the events are described in the language of myth and metaphor, and therefore shouldn't be pressed for a sort of literality. It doesn't mean that Adam had to be literally created out of dirt and Eve by some kind of surgery out of his rib. It doesn't mean that God's literally walking in the garden, and it's anthropomorphic portrayal of God. These stories would be rich in mythic imagery, and this would, I think, free the biblical scholar and scientist to be much more open in following the scientific evidence where it leads, because he isn't bound to a sort of literalistic interpretation of Genesis 1 to 11. So I know this is radical for many conservative Christians, but I wonder how open RTB would be willing, or it would be, toward looking again at whether or not we've really understood this genre of literature, or whether we've been insensitive to the genre that it is, and therefore misconstrued it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you that we have these kind of conversations on an ongoing basis at RTB within, among our scholar team, and even within the scholar community. And actually, while the official view of the ministry is a day-age perspective, there are a number of people that are part of the scholar team that actually would be more open to like an analogical day view. And so there are people that are connected to our scholar community that would actually hold to the framework view, to an intermittent day view. I mean, there's a number of views that are represented by the RTB scholar community. So there's a real openness, I think, to engaging, the theological and the interpretive questions related to Genesis, 1 through 11. And I would consider myself a day-age creationist, but I mean, the more that I read Genesis 1 to 11, and even just simply the Genesis 1 text, the more that I appreciate, for example, the framework view, the more that I appreciate the fact that it could very well be an apologetic or a polemic against ancient Near Eastern myth. I see elements of that. I think that it is a text that's influenced by the ancient Near Eastern milieu, right? But we would also take the view that even there is a history there. It's a compressed history, I think, in Genesis 1 through 11, where, as you mentioned, it just seems like things are racing along. I'm sure there's a lot of gaps in the history where you have these different accounts that are kind of compressed together. So you want to be very careful about reading things, as you read the compressed history. I think you want to be very careful. I think there are symbolic elements and mythical elements that are within the text as well. And so I'm sympathetic to your point, and we are in conversation continually about what is the best way to think about Genesis 1 to 11. I mean, again, I personally would say that I'm a day-age person, but I'm adopting increasingly a view that you might even call a day-age view that is somewhat of a composite, where I think, there's elements of all of that in Genesis 1 and specifically, which to me makes it an incredibly remarkable passage of scripture in so many ways. But as a scientist looking at Genesis 1, I just can't help but to see this remarkable correspondence between the Earth's history and life's history and what you see in Genesis 1. When I was in college, I was an agnostic, and I had a friend. I grew up in West Virginia, or went to college in West Virginia. Grew up in West Virginia. It's the heart of the Bible Belt. I had a friend whose father was a Baptist minister, and he and I would get into these conversations. He was a young Earth creationist, and we would get into conversations about Genesis 1. And I can remember even then, as a non-believer, looking at Genesis 1, and I can remember telling my friend David, if you just look at day as a period of time, this is amazing what you see here. So I guess the scientist in me, when I look at Genesis 1, I still see that correspondence. But so I don't want us to adopt an approach to Genesis 1 that maybe gives up something of genuine apologetic value. I mean, to me, if the Holy Spirit is ultimately inspiring this text, is it possible, even though it is, again, a text put together under the influence of the ancient Near Eastern world, where there's all these things that the author is trying to accomplish theologically, and maybe even sociologically with the text, is it still possible that in the midst of that the Holy Spirit could inspire it to be written in such a way that in the future, as we're making these discoveries, we see that there is this correspondence that these accounts are not out of step with what science ultimately is telling us about the reality of the cosmos, I guess, right? So
I'd just like to echo Fuzz's response and also point out a chapter that our colleague Ken Samples wrote in the Old Earth or Evolutionary Creationism book between RTB and BioLogos, the chapter 3, where it sort of talks about our approach, and I think Fuzz just hit on it very poignantly there at the end. It's like, well, of course it was an ancient Near Eastern literature, and it probably has elements of that type of literature, but it was inspired, and it wasn't just for that people in that time. It's for all peoples in all times, and so there's got to be truths there that will be meaningful to us in the 21st century. So anyway, Steve, it's your turn for the next question.
Okay, I will not ask a theological question, although I do have a lot of sympathy for the last question.
You need to lean in and talk louder because it's hard to hear you again. Sorry.
All right. I was just saying I do have a lot of sympathy for the last theological question that was asked, but I'm not asking a theological question. I want to pick up on the very last thing that was in the presentation there on the mosaic idea, AJ's mosaic idea, which can get around a lot of genetic problems, because if you pick the right chromosomes to put into all of these sperm or eggs, whichever, you can make your genetics look exactly like it's a population, because it is a population. You've effectively got common descent in a single pair of people, and just, I guess, are you open to, say, making those chromosomes you're taking be from existing hominids, or from representing something very much like draws from that population, because that's kind of what you need to make it look like the genetics we see. If you want to have a fairly recent mosaic, they should be drawn from, resemble the kinds of genetic variation we see in an existing population. And I guess there's the second part to that, is the sort of subversive question that is, if you're willing to go this far to make your creation model look exactly like evolution, at what point do you just say, well, why don't you just say they evolved? So that's, you don't have to answer that one.
I think he's got a great answer for that one, Steve.
Okay.
We haven't mentioned it yet, but there will be a book coming out in October, and one of the things that Fuzz does in one of the chapters of that book is he addresses sort of what's at stake for the RTB perspective or constituency or model if certain elements of evolution are true, especially in regard to human evolution. I don't know if you want to address that or not, the theological issues that are... Even though he's not asking a theological question, he asks, why wouldn't you go that route? And I think our response is, we don't go that route because we think the evolutionary route raises theological questions that are very difficult to handle. So,
Yeah, that's the, I mean, part of the discomfort I think that we have is AJ's pointing out with, with kind of a strict evolutionary perspective on human origins is, again, a lot of the theological issues that come from it, in terms of, I think it bears on issues relating to biblical inerrancy. It bears on issues as to how do we understand the image of God, how do we understand the fall, original sin. There's just a lot of issues that get intertwined with adopting, in our perspective, a strict evolutionary approach to humanity's origin. And so we think that those biblical and theological issues come at perhaps too high of a cost just to simply, capitulate to an evolutionary interpretation. And so I think you just wind up with, I think, a much cleaner, you position yourself much more cleanly in terms of theological issues when you are looking for, again, a historical Adam and Eve that are sole progenitors. And so the question is, how do we wrestle with the data to get to that point? So,
but you can have Adam and Eve as sole progenitors of the entire human race, and yet they have biological ancestors, right? Why can't God infuse into a Homo heidelbergensis a rational soul so that he becomes Adam? Why? What's the problem with that? And in fact, when you quoted, Fuzz, from Genesis 2:7 and 2:19 about how both animals and man were created from the dust of the earth, that was what came to my mind. I thought, wow, it's a metaphorical description of how they both have these same sort of biological ancestors.
What came to my mind as a virologist was something completely different.
That what?
What came to my mind as a virologist was something completely different.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think when you start talking about, again, and this is, part of the I think, the concern, I think, with postulating, people outside the Garden of Eden, you then have, right, you then have, issues with, if you're arguing, again, that there's an evolutionary history of some sort, even if God is intervening and selecting two and infusing a soul into those two, you still have these other creatures around that seem to be, that would seem to, I think, to have, that, well, I guess I'm thinking about not this in terms of Homo heidelbergensis. I've not thought about it in those terms. But I'm talking about if you have a pair that you are selecting, from a population of modern humans, and you're saying these are Adam and Eve, and everybody has this evolutionary, origin, to me, it raises questions about the image of God and who has the image of God, who doesn't have the image of God, that type of thing. So it just seems to me that it creates a pretty theologically messy situation that's resolved if you're just having a sole progenitor, right? That is a de novo.
De novo.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
So, sorry to turn your non-theological question into a theological answer, Steve. Would you like to try again?
No, that's fine. That's fine. I was sneaking in something there. That was.
Yeah.
Can I try my hand at a theological question?
Please.
Like many good atheists, I'm Jesuit educated, so I can,
All right.
I can give this a try.
God bless the Jesuits for good education.
I used to not just hear about image of God; it was image and likeness, right? Wow. So why are we not talking about likeness first of all? And image up here had a lot to do with cognitive capacities and so forth. So perhaps likeness is more like genotype, phenotype sort of thing. So here's my question. We know that, and from your own blogs, you were very big on Neanderthals couldn't be human because they didn't interbreed. Well, now we know they did. So on the genotype-phenotype question, Neanderthals absolutely had incompatibility with humans. And we also know from your remarkable summary of the cognitive capacity of other animals, of non-human animals, that there's a continuum of that as well. So there's a continuum of evolution heading towards the cognitive capacities that we call image of God. There's a continuum of genotype-phenotype that we can call likeness of God, and they all can converge and interbreed and cooperate on this nice continuum with humanity. So I guess like it gets harder to define it as a uniquely human thing on either the genotype, phenotype, or in the cognitive capacities, image or likeness.
So I'm sorry, what was the...
So the question is, it seems like you have a convergence of all of these supposedly uniquely human things that we actually see popping up in other populations. So whether it's genotype, phenotype with Neanderthals and definitely interbreeding that happened there, it's hard to define those as separate species when there was so much gene flow. And then the cognitive capacities of other animals, emotional experience, even theory of mind. I mean, there are animals that have a concept that other animals know something different than they know. It's really getting to the point where you see humans on this continuum. Now, if this image likeness pre-existed before humans did, everything evolved to meet it, that seems weird. But then if it was just infused, how do you explain all of the evidence that pre-exists?
Yeah.
Good theological question.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the Neanderthal interbreeding, I mean, my preference would be that there was no evidence for that, but that's just not the case, right? So
evidence rarely cares about our preferences.
Yes, that's right. So, but I mean, I will point out that I think you could still maintain the idea that Neanderthals and humans were indeed distinct species in light of the interbreeding, simply because we don't see evidence for any Neanderthal contribution to the Y chromosome. So that suggests that either the male hybrids were either non-viable or not fertile. So that already begins to suggest there's some kind of incompatibility between them. There's, of course, the Neanderthal deserts in the human genome. And in fact, there was just a paper I was reading that was suggesting that the places where you see the deserts correspond to genes that seem to be responsible for anatomical features that are distinct, that make modern humans and Neanderthals distinct. And so,
that could be circular, but there could also be a selective reason for that. So, yeah.
So, but the point is that this is suggesting that this was, again, something that was really between, two distinct species. And, there is mention, of course, of what appears to be interbreeding in the Genesis 1 through 11 accounts, like the Nephilim. But when I read those accounts, it sounds to me as if God is actually displeased with the idea of those interbreeding events. It's not as if God is celebrating that. And so I get the sense that there is this, divine displeasure with that. And so, it's not out of the question that there could be interbreeding that happens without, losing kind of our distinctive, I guess, as human beings, or as being, humans within Adam, I guess, where this is just simply reflecting something that's outside the divine will. And, some of these interbreeding events presumably are introducing information into the human genome that's attributable now to, or seems to be part of the etiology of certain disease conditions, right, that humans struggle with. Others seem to have offered a benefit, particularly when it comes to the immune genes. And of course, there's this concept that what we might intend for evil, God can use for good. So could there be a way that somehow God is redeeming those acts in spite of being displeased with it? And so, I don't, and again, I would just say that compatibility is, in our model would be a reflection of common design as opposed to, again, kind of a shared evolutionary history. So that's how we would see this. I have not done a lot of work looking at the animal behavioral studies. So that's an area that I need to tackle. But, I recently read a book by Marion Stamp Dawkins, who's done work in animal behavioral studies. And a big part of the book is cautioning against how we would actually interpret the results of those animal behavioral studies, where her argument is that even people that are highly skilled working in these areas are highly susceptible to anthropomorphism. And so we see behaviors and we have a tendency to try to begin to attribute kind of human mental states, and we're imposing human mental processes, cognitive processes on animals, when maybe in fact, that's really not the case whatsoever. I don't know, there are, there was a study published about a year and a half ago, maybe now, where this, I'll get you the reference here, I don't have it off the top of my head, but the argument in the study was essentially that in AI systems that are based on machine learning or associative learning, you can actually in those AI systems develop essentially what looks like problem-solving abilities. And there was modeling that was done that showed that in these corvid studies where the corvids are looking like they're doing planning, in chimp studies where the chimps are doing problem solving, that you can actually get that behavior through associative learning just like you would get out of an AI system. And so this at least I think throws some caution on maybe that there actually is this continuum with regard to animal behavior leading up to modern humans. And you do see, at least in the literature, where people are trying to explain the origin of language, where there seems to be a real struggle with how do you take animal communication and from that evolve the capacity for symbolism. So I guess my point is, I'm not familiar with that literature maybe to the degree that I need to be, but I've seen enough other studies that suggest that maybe this idea that there's this nice continuum may not be, there may be other ways to view those behavioral studies, right?
I know we come back to that again, but it's, again, that very clear continuum in your mind is a paradigmatic interpretation. And, we were just talking at the table over lunch. It's this idea we anthropomorphize cells, we give them agencies, we talk about them as though they're making decisions. We certainly do that about viruses, and that's been a soapbox of mine for a very long time, that viruses don't actually have volition. But anyway, maybe that's arguable. I don't know. Maybe it's arguable, maybe it's not. I just want to check back in with Steve and with Bill and see if you guys have one more question, either of you. And if not, I'm actually going to open it up to the floor. But don't feel like you're robbing the floor if one of you guys still have a pressing question.
I don't have a question. I just one very brief comment, which is that it has been suggested that there is introgression in for a Y chromosome, that the oldest or the most diverged Y chromosome represents introgression within Africa. And that's the kind of thing we really can't test currently.
Okay, sweet.
I have a brief comment too. The reason nobody's talking about likeness, Nathan, is because most of us here are Protestants. And Protestant
Not all of us, but most of us.
Identifies the image and likeness of God, in contrast to traditional Roman Catholic theology, which differentiates the image of God and the likeness of God. For Catholic theologians, the image of God is constituted by our resembling God and having an immortal soul and rationality, freedom of the will, and self-consciousness. But the likeness refers to the original righteousness that Adam and Eve possessed. And so the Catholic view is that in the fall, man lost his likeness to God because he lost his original righteousness. But he retains the image. He's still in God's image, but no longer like him. And the likeness then is restored in Christ when a person is forgiven and reconciled to God, and Christ's righteousness is given to him. Then the likeness of God is restored. So it's an interesting.
So it's not genotype, phenotype.
No, so we got to define terms again. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you for that.
Well, as promised. Oh, right. Oh, my bad. Oh, I'm so sorry. I teased the audience prematurely, because before you get your opportunity, it's Dr. Swamadas's opportunity to see if he has a question a question for Fuzz, and Fuzz to have an opportunity to respond. Sorry about that.
Thanks a lot, no problem.
Yeah,
and I asked Hugh if I'm allowed to ask you a hard question. And I was very nervous about this.
These have all been really easy questions. So finally, a hard question.
It's a hard question because, I mean, I feel very self-conscious about this because I'm totally a guest in your house. You guys have been amazing hosts. I have great respect, and I would even say love for you, Fuzz, so that's not where any of this is coming from.
Yeah, so ask your question.
All right, so
ask your question.
I have to lead into it because this is hard for me, all right? So I'm going to start with Richard Owens, who you really point to, and I actually think there's much to sympathize with him on. And actually the story I want to tell is actually from about 160 years ago, right after The Origin of Species comes out, because that's when the public debates between Huxley and Owens start going back and forth. And it's centered around, they called it the Great Hippocampus Debate. And what was going on is that, much like actually maybe even most secular scientists would agree, Owens was saying that there's something exceptional about humans. And Huxley was saying that man's place in nature, as he would publish in 1963, is that we're just no different than animals. Now, we are much more alike in animals than people expected at that time, but we are also exceptional, and we can debate about the exact language of that. And so he's making an argument that actually ultimately proved true. But the way how he did it is by saying that the human brain has a hippocampus and monkeys don't have it. And it culminated actually with a very embarrassing event where Huxley is sitting there saying, but I have a monkey brain in my pocket. And he pulled out the monkey brain and actually dissected it in front of people and showed, yes, it actually does have a hippocampus. If we were to take Richard Owens from that time, put him here, we would agree with all of his conclusions, but then he would come up and say, and the way how we know this is that humans are unique in our hippocampus. And all of us would cringe. We would all cringe because maybe he's right, but that is not the right way to make the argument. And it's painful to watch it because it's actually a good point. And in fact, if you look at how history really responded to that, Richard Owens does not have a respected place in science, and it's not really about the rejection of evolution, it's how he handled that mistake. He held on to and clung to that argument for a very long time. And so my question for you is, you kind of identify him as a person to respect, and I actually would respect him too, but can you be better than him? Can you be the type of person who has made good faith arguments, as I believe his argument was good faith too, but can you abandon arguments that might not be the best? And I've already seen it in you when you talked I was truly impressed. Actually, both Nathan and I traded a glance of impressedness when you said we're backing away from the Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve. But when you got to the population genetics part, I was very similar to Stephen Schaffner, where I think I was cringing because there's so much that I agree with you about. I believe that the population genetics case against your model has been wildly overstated. So much so I put my personal reputation on the line in public to defend you. But I was also very disappointed to see that you attributed the time to most recent 4 alleles, not to me, but to Anne Gager's work that didn't even mention that. And you can go outside of science, outside of mainstream science, I should say. I wouldn't say outside of science, but outside of mainstream science to make this case. But I'm just telling you, you have a very strong case in your defense within mainstream science if you can just let go of the bad arguments. Another place where I just cringed is what the stuff you were pointing to regarding Mouflon's sheep and the claim, which is totally false, that population genetics models are not validated. That is demonstrably false. I can sit down and show it to you. And I understand where it's coming from because...
Josh, do you have a question?
My question is, this is what I'm getting back to, is I'm willing to help immensely, and this is not an attack on your conclusions. I feel like I'm talking to Richard Owens right now, so take that as a compliment. To what extent can you, and I know this is a hard question, and I don't mean this accusatory, and maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, I will go public and explain exactly how I was wrong and you were right. So let's leave that off the side, but are you willing to let go of those things and be better than Richard Owens on those things?
So what particularly are you...
So for example, one example was you said that population genetics models have not been validated by actually, when you know the answer, you go test it and see if it corresponds. Actually, in fact, I have been part of actually validating those. I've seen other people do it. I can point to the paper after paper after paper where these population genetic models are validated. And so that's not a claim that I can defend publicly. I think it's trivial to show is not true. And so how do I actually give scientific legitimacy to it when I can demonstrate it's not true. And then that's like one example. The other one is the details, which we don't have to get into now, about, for example, the mouflon sheep. I think you just have a much stronger argument against the false claims made against you guys, a much stronger argument that you could just take.
So Josh, are you saying, I hear you asking two things. One is, if you can convince Fuzz that the evidence for validating the population genetics estimations pan out in studies in conservation biology.
That's not what I said. I said these population genetic models are validated in cases where we know the answer. Yeah. No, this is for, yeah.
Okay, so I guess Fuzz would probably have to know the nature of the validation before he could even answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, because I've done literature search after literature search asking the question, has somebody done studies that would say, you know, that these methods that are used to calculate or estimate population sizes have been validated, that there's some independent basis to place confidence in those results. And I've not been able to find anything. When I do that kind of search, I find these articles in conservation biology where consistently, again, you know, and I understand that there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between what they're doing in those studies and what people are doing necessarily when they're estimating population sizes. But when I see that these models are not performing as would be expected, that to me is a red flag that at least is saying I'm a little suspect about how much confidence do I place in this result. Now, I think for somebody who's working in human origins and viewing human origins from an evolutionary perspective, the question of the precise population size is in some respects a trivial question. It's not, but for what we're doing, it's a very important question. And so that's just simply the point that I'm trying to make with those studies. So I would be happy if somebody shows me that these methods are valid. I would be happy to say, okay, here's the demonstration that these methods are valid, and then I'm satisfied. So to me, citing those studies is essentially my attempt to say this is what I find when I do that.
Well, then let me back off the hard point. I'll just say that right now. I'll say there's several scientists, including me, that really want to sit down and kind of give you that way to actually engage with mainstream science, where you don't have to have the arguments that don't make sense to us. You can actually have some arguments that completely support your final conclusion, but actually...
So see, that's a separate question,
yes,
though.
absolutely, that's what I'm
you're
saying.
basically saying we have a better way for you to approach this with mainstream scientists, and it's a distinct question. So, you know, if this is an important point to Fuzz, the point that he's making about method validation, until that's answered in his question, he may not want to abandon.
Sure, I'm not asking for him to abandon it right now. And I got the answer, and I think it's a positive I want to emphasize, and I've already pointed to the places you've done it. What I'm hearing is that you actually will be better than Richard Owens, and that's actually why I want to work with you. So.
Well, I mean, but the thing is, you know, and again, you know, there is a documented history in Who Was Adam where we have made statements, and we have, when we've been demonstrated to be wrong, we've revised accordingly. So I'm not unwilling to do that. But at the same token, I'm also, you know, I also have convictions that are not that in this case this is not a theological conviction. This is a scientific conviction.
I agree.
You know, just part of my, I mean, kind of my work in science is I worked for 10 years in a Fortune 500 company where I was responsible for ensuring that business decisions that involved millions of dollars were based on data that was produced by methods that were reliable. And so I understand the science of method validation inside and out. And so I'm just bringing that experience to the table here, and I'm saying, how do I know? This is a very important point for our model. It may not be important for other people, but it's important for our model. So how do I know that method is validated? And I've made attempts to try to find work where people have done that. And the only study that I can find, and again, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. And so if you can show me that, I'm perfectly happy, you know. But is the Quentin Atkinson paper? That was the only paper I could find where somebody actually said, how do we know that these population sizes are actually giving us, actual results? That's the only study I've been able to find.
No, I'm hearing, and I accept that. What you're saying is that you have legitimate, good faith objections still, but you actually want to work through this. And I think that's exactly what a good scientist would say, and I'm satisfied. I just want you to know that the objections that Steve had are exactly what I would have, but I just don't think that they're necessary. There's a way to make your case that would not be objectionable. In fact, it would be even seen as a positive contribution to our understanding of population genetics. And we want to help, okay? So that's all. Thanks a lot.